Hi guys, and welcome to the Conan Fitness Platinum webinar. This month we're looking at muscle endurance. Basically, this is a follow-on from the cardiovascular endurance, the more generalized webinar we did on the energy systems and cardiovascular endurance, which was a follow-on from our basic training guidelines. So this time we're looking a little bit more specifically at local muscle endurance and what are the factors that improve local muscle endurance that, for a muscle to be able to work at a higher capacity for longer. What sorts of factors are involved and what can we do from a training perspective to increase it, to be better on that front. Well, let's just quickly recap where we left off from last time. When we did cardiovascular endurance, we kind of looked at the journey of an oxygen molecule. Basically, we said that, from an oxygen molecule being out here in the universe, we breathe that into our lungs. From the lungs, it goes into these alveoli, the capillary sacs in the lungs, and then that goes into the bloodstream. From the bloodstream, that goes into, the red blood cells and the hemoglobin carry it, and factors like cardiac output and hydration, things like that affect how efficiently that's done. And then the blood capillaries, which go around a muscle cell, each of the muscle cells, and that's what gets it to the local muscle level. And that's where we stopped, because basically we said all those factors along the way can be improved, and even improvements in just small amounts over the course of that whole journey can make a really big difference in the end. So what we want to look at now is what happens from once the oxygen molecule hits the muscle, and how does muscle's work capacity improve or be affected by this, not just from the oxygen, meaning aerobic metabolism, but we're also going to look at anaerobic metabolism tonight as well. So let's move on. On the local muscle level, you can see a picture here of a local muscle. Some of the main factors that we already mentioned was capillarization, or the increased capillary density around muscle cells. So you can see the red blood cells around the muscle. With training and with extra stimulus, the body literally grows extra density of capillaries around the muscle, and that gives us a greater surface area for oxygen and nutrients, things like glucose, to get to the muscle cell and to be able to diffuse, or to get into the cell. The next thing is you see these mitochondria, the blue things in this little diagram here. They're like the energy warehouses within a cell. So they're the things where oxygen and the glucose and nutrients go into, and it's like the energy factory where all the chemical processes take place for respiration, basically what we call internal respiration, where we take nutrients and kind of like combustion. You got a fuel source, you got oxygen, and you end off with heat and energy. And that happens in the mitochondria. So what happens with training stimulus is that we get mitochondrial density increases. That means that the size of the mitochondria, the number of the mitochondria within a cell literally increases. And within those mitochondria, you've heard of the different types of, like slow twitch fiber muscles, fast twitch fiber muscles, or maybe the aerobic energy systems versus anaerobic energy systems. Basically, all these mitochondria have the ability to metabolize the substrates, your carbohydrates, your fats, your proteins, in an oxidative manner. Oxidative means with oxygen, so that's aerobic. There's also glycolytic, meaning the anaerobic, or the ones that do it without oxygen. So they only do glucose, they only burn glucose, they can't burn fat anaerobically in this manner. But what happens is it literally increases the amount of oxidative enzymes, meaning that it makes it more aerobic with training, with aerobic training, and the better availability we have to get oxygen to the muscles, we increase those oxidative enzymes, and that helps us to stay out of the whole burn zone, the whole anaerobic zone. We can actually work at a higher rate without tipping into that anaerobic zone. So what about from here? These are the factors we've mentioned actual within the local muscle level, but there are other factors like the ability to supply glucose, for instance. So you might have oxygen, but if you don't have glucose, you run out of energy. Things like lactate buffering. So we know that with anaerobic metabolism that when you're breaking down glucose, and we're going to go into this in a little bit more detail soon, but as we all know, you get like lactic acid or lactate buildup. And our body's ability to buffer that is a really big factor as far as local muscle endurance goes, and we're going to look at that in a bit more detail as soon as we've done the energy systems. So when it comes to the energy system, there's three systems that work differently to provide our energy. Our main energy source is ATP, adenosine triphosphate, and that's the little wanky term that just means that's the unit of energy that the cells of our body uses. And really there's three systems that produce these ATP molecules, and we've got to constantly build them up because we're always using them. The first is the aerobic, and really simply this uses oxygen to metabolize the substrates or the fuel sources, things like fat, glucose, etc. So it uses oxygen. It's a really effective way of producing energy because it can produce large quantities of these ATP molecules. The problem being it can only really do it at relatively low intensity levels because it's a fairly slow process. It's quite a long process of breaking down fats and breaking down glucose. So that's when intensity starts to get up a little higher, keep in mind that at all times, all three energy systems are always working. And that's sometimes a bit of a misconception because people think that, at low levels it's only aerobic and at high levels of intensity it's only anaerobic, which is not true. You're always using all three. It's just that, at lower intensities it's predominantly aerobic. At higher intensities, the proportion, it's basically a gradual continuum, if you will. As the intensity increases, the percentage of energy that's derived from the anaerobic sources is increased. So one of the highest or quickest, most immediate forms of energy production is what we call the phosphate system, or the creatine phosphate system, phosphocreatine, and that basically just breaks down these stored energies, these stored molecules. They're already there, breaks it down. It's immediate energy, and we're not going to go too much into that now because it's not so relevant to our localized muscle endurance and what we can do to improve it, because you can't improve it by a huge amount. We're talking, 8 to 10 seconds worth of intense exercise. But the other form of anaerobic metabolism is glycolysis, and that's very, very pertinent to what we're talking about, because other than aerobic, that's the other main energy source. That's where we're breaking down glucose without the presence of oxygen, or at least insufficient oxygen. And we break it down, the byproduct is lactic acid. Everyone talks about, lactic acid or lactate. It's actually pyruvate, a molecule called pyruvate that is there's actually 10 steps in glycolysis, in the breakdown of a glucose molecule, pyruvate being the last one. It's just that what happens to that pyruvate, one of its fates, one of the things that can happen to it is being turned into lactic acid or lactate. And we'll go into the difference shortly, because the difference is very, very pertinent to how we train, as in getting clear on what actually happens with that is a big difference. And we often give lactic acid a pretty bad name, saying it's it's evil, it's the dead end waste product of glycolytic metabolism, but it's not necessarily the case. Lactic acid is often believed to be the thing that creates the fatigue in the muscle, and it's kind of true, but it's a little bit too generalized. What happens if we look at this next slide, and without getting too technical, if you can imagine a glucose molecule going through its 10 steps of breakdown from a glucose molecule and ending up at this pyruvate molecule, what happens from here is it's got a couple of different fates. One of those fates is that the pyruvate simply goes through what's called the Krebs cycle, or the aerobic cycle, and it's actually used in energy, for further energy production. So that in itself is certainly not a bad thing. It's a good thing because you get further energy out of it. While this glycolytic breakdown from glucose to pyruvate is really quick and can give you some fast energy, it can, in the presence of oxygen, if you've got sufficient oxygen, like we're talking about the ability of the body to get oxygen to the muscle cells, it can then go through this further breakdown, which is a little bit longer, a little bit slower, but can provide a lot more energy through the normal aerobic pathway. However, under other certain circumstances, just one of them being not enough oxygen, this can also happen in the presence of oxygen, but usually it's without enough oxygen. Pyruvate gets turned into our what we call the lactic acid. And shortly after that, rather than us saying lactic acid, the difference between lactic acid, which is within the muscle, is lactic acid doesn't stay as lactic acid for very long. It almost immediately breaks down into a lactate molecule and a hydrogen ion. So you can see that here. There's a lactate molecule, which is the base thing of lactic acid, and a hydrogen ion. Now, the reason why this is important is because lactate itself, which we generalize as being a bad thing, isn't a bad thing at all. It's actually another energy source. So we like lactate and we can use it as energy. It's the hydrogen ions that is more likely to be the problem, because that an ion, by the way, is a charged particle. So it's this is what increases acidity. It actually lowers your pH of your blood, and that means acidic. That's where acidosis comes from. That's where we're more likely to get our that burning feeling. But still, lactate's given the rap as far as being the dead end waste product, or it's responsible for fatigue and burn, and it's responsible for the acidosis and that delayed onset of muscle soreness. You know what they call DOMS, the sore muscles the next day after training, and that's certainly not the case. If anything, it's the hydrogen ions, but even though that does the acidity, it's certainly not responsible for the muscle soreness, as most people overgeneralize to say. So what happens with this lactate molecule is a couple of things. We mentioned last time that within the muscle, lactate's basically reused again. It can actually get turned back into pyruvate and then obviously just go through that cycle again. Or if the rate at which it's produced, so as we increase the intensity of our exercise or our workload, we start to produce lactate at a higher amount. As we produce lactate faster and faster, our uptake, meaning how we buffer it, that's how we use it in the aerobic cycle, or how we recycle it, also increases. So typically you'll find someone, let's say an endurance athlete, who's doing a triathlon or a long run or a ride or a swim or something like that, and they're going for quite a long period of time at a fairly high intensity. Their lactate levels don't go screaming high, because although the rate of production is increased, so too is the rate of uptake of the lactic acid or lactate. And it's only when within the muscle that the rate of increase of production increases so quickly or so much that it then starts to spill out of the muscle and spill into the blood. And it's when it spills into the blood, that's when you'll start to see blood lactate increase. And when we talk about lactate levels, it's typically blood lactate, because lactic acid itself is in the muscle, but when it gets turned into lactate and spills out, that's what we measure. Typically when exercise physiologists measure someone's blood lactate while they're exercising, it comes from the blood, not the muscle. So we're talking about lactate in the blood. What happens to it from there is also very interesting, because it also tells us what can happen if we train effectively enough, is that once it's in the blood, again, it's not just this byproduct that is a waste and causes problems. It can actually then also be used again. So it sounds quite funny, like this big cycling process of energy, but that's exactly what it is. So before we go into that, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail, because it can go back to the liver and get turned back into glucose, go through a cycle again, or it can actually just be used, like we said, that lactate molecule, certain cells of the body, including muscles, as we've just said, even other muscles, if that lactate molecule is produced in your leg, for instance, and it spills out into the blood, it can go to another muscle that's not working as hard, that has more oxygen available, and be turned back into pyruvate and go through that cycle again. Or it goes to the liver and gets turned back to glucose in the liver, can be used again. And certain cells, like the heart, even things like the brain, actually use lactate just as it is. Instead of breaking down glucose, a significant proportion of their energy use comes from lactate. So it is a really good energy source. It's funny that some people say that lactate actually helps delay fatigue, which is really weird because before about the 70s or 80s, when everyone said lactate is the enemy, now they're saying that lactate is a very helpful intermediary byproduct of metabolism, and it's those other factors, things like the hydrogen ions, things like other factors that are limiting, that cause actual onset of muscle fatigue, not the lactate itself. But when it comes down to our training and our capacity for workload, our body's ability to work at a high intensity for long, people will now say that it's our pace at lactate threshold that is the best performance predictor, the best predictor of your performance. Meaning, remember we said only when lactate production builds up so quickly that it hits a point where the uptake isn't met and it starts to spill out into the blood. And once it starts to spill out into the blood, we see this kind of marked increase in blood lactate accumulation. What we mentioned last time was called onset of blood lactate accumulation, or lactate threshold, which a lot of people also call anaerobic threshold. And that point, the speed or the pace at which you can run or ride or exercise at, whatever it is, that is at that point, that's your best predictor of performance. So if we can increase that lactate threshold, that anaerobic threshold, then we're increasing the amount of work capacity we can do and maintain for a long period of time. So let's look at that in a little bit more detail. This is kind of just a diagrammatic view, and without it looking too confusing, here's our muscle, here's our liver, and there's a diagram of the blood. Imagine a glucose molecule from the blood that goes into the muscle, and it's either stored as glycogen or it's used, in anaerobic glycolysis, metabolism, and we know that we get this lactic acid formation, which then breaks down into lactate. And from there, our lactate can, as I said, either get used in the muscle or it can spill out into the blood, which can then also go back into the liver as lactate. And through this process of gluconeogenesis, just meaning the genesis of new glucose, to make new glucose in the liver, and that glucose can then either just get stored in the liver, which is called glycogen, or it gets put back out into the blood to be recycled. So that's just a diagrammatic view of how that happens. And with our training, that happens more and more efficiently or effectively. And this is just another view of it. Here's our muscle here. Here's our liver. We know that the glucose in the muscle goes into pyruvate, as we said. One of the fates of pyruvate is to turn into lactate. It can also go into the aerobic cycle as well, and that's even better because it can do that forever without too much dramas, provided there's adequate oxygen, and that comes down to our general cardiovascular endurance, which we mentioned last time. And also at the lactate level here, if it builds up too much, spills out into the blood, that's where we get our lactate threshold, then this can be cycled back into the liver and turned back into glucose, basically just reversing the process. It does cost energy to do that, but it's typically aerobic, and that can be cycled through again. Now that's only one of its fates. Lactate that goes in the blood, as we mentioned, can also be used by other muscles. If it's produced in an arm muscle, for instance, it can be used in a leg or something like that. It can be used by the heart. It can be used by other organs like the brain, etc. So a very important thing to consider. When it comes to the tips on putting all this together, how do we train to increase lactate threshold? If we've said that this physiological marker, the point where lactate production builds up so quick that it outweighs lactate uptake, how can we increase that? Because if that's our best predictor for performance, then that's what we want to focus on. And a couple of key points, there's a lot of things we can do, but I'd just like to highlight the key points. The first is specificity. So if we're training for instance, running, let's say, then we want the principle of overload. Remember, the principle of overload states that when we put the body under a stimulus that it's not used to, that it then goes through a compensation period. Like it tries to, if you lift a weight that the muscles aren't used to lifting, eventually it becomes used to doing it because it super compensates. And that's the principle of overload. Well, we want the principle of overload to replicate the muscle activity so that the same muscle fibers are being used in the same way that you will in performance. So if it's cycling, that's different to pole vaulting, which is different to swimming, which is different to kayaking. So specificity is important. The next thing is a long aerobic base. So part of our training for localized muscle endurance will still involve a long aerobic base, because even though we're talking about lactic threshold, we still want the whole, remember we talked about the mitochondria, the oxidative enzymes, the increase in capillaries or capillarization, and the ability to provide oxygen and glucose to the cells, and things like cardiac output and all those things that happen on a general level in cardiopulmonary systems will all help the availability of those things at the muscle level. Once that's also happened, a major part of our training also needs to be that higher level intensity. And this is where we get to lactate threshold training. So there definitely needs to be some high intensity stuff, because when it comes to things like increased buffering, remember when we said we build up lactate within the muscle and also within the blood as it spills out. We mentioned buffering before, and that's the ability to reuse that pyruvate or that the lactic acid, and to buffer those hydrogen ions. The buffering is done through bicarbonate. If you've ever heard of an athlete trying to take the old sodium bicarb stuff to increase their performance during training or during an event, that's where it comes from, because in our body we buffer hydrogen ions and the lactic acid with bicarbonate. But the more we train around this level, meaning in that kind of lactic acid burn zone, the better the body gets at doing that buffering. The more efficient it gets at the whole pyruvate and lactate cycling, the more efficient it gets at turning the lactate to glucose, in other muscles and in the liver. So essentially, a significant portion of our training does need to be just below, at, or around about the lactate threshold, or even just above. Now, we know we can get into the stimulus of lactic acid, as in the stimulus of lactate, by just going really, really intense. But the key to balance all this is that you want to spend a bit of time there. Now, if you go really, really intense, 100% max, then while you're definitely going to be producing huge quantities of lactate, which is fantastic as a stimulus for the body to get better at using it, the problem there is that you certainly can't maintain that for very long. So while you're under this wicked stimulus of lactate in the body, and that's a stimulus for the body to get better at using it, you're not in that zone for very long. Whereas being just at the threshold, and sometimes even just below or just out, or sometimes just above, then you've got the ability to maintain it for a longer period of time. And that sounds a little bit nasty, I know, because it kind of means, if it's really intense, you can get over and done with. If it's low intensity, you can do it forever and it doesn't hurt. This is kind of like the painstaking zone, because you're in that slight discomfort or quite a bit of discomfort, and you're trying to maintain it as long as possible. So, putting it together, train with specificity. If you want to be Olympic rower, spending all your time on a bike isn't going to help you. So specificity is one. The long aerobic base, that means the long, doing the mileage, the time, just putting the time in the hours in building the aerobic base, and then intermittently doing the lactate threshold training, whether that's in interval work or short, hard, fast bouts followed by recoveries. However you do that is fine, so long as you're regularly in that that high lactic acid zone and getting the body under that stimulus to improve. So that's it, guys, for local muscle endurance. Hopefully you can put those tips in. Hopefully it gives you a new insight into how smart the body is and how it uses energy, particularly lactate, instead of just giving it the bad rap all the time. And hope you get something from that. Until next time, we'll wish you all the best.